Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. So I've just spent the last 2 weeks in conversations about the shooting in Tumbler Ridge. As I'm sure most of you already know, on February 10th, an 18-year-old opened fire on a local high school, killing 8 people and leaving more than 24 injured. Now, I'm not an expert on this kind of violence, but the reason reporters and governments wanted to talk to me was because of what the shooter had been doing before the attack. According to several people at OpenAI, the perpetrator's ChatGPT account had been flagged and eventually banned for using their models, quote, in furtherance of violent activities. But OpenAI chose not to inform law enforcement. And now, in the aftermath of one of the deadliest shootings in our country's history, Canadians are asking, why not? Look, leaving these decisions in the hands of a company like OpenAI is incredibly misguided and frankly dangerous. But the narrative that's emerged over the last month, this idea that AI companies should be reporting all violent conversations to police, is much more complicated than it sounds. And it has very real implications for our collective privacy. So I wanted to talk to Meredith Whittaker. Whittaker is the president of Signal, the encrypted messaging app used by journalists, dissidents, and governments all over the world. Signal doesn't collect your data or serve you ads or track who you're talking to. When authorities ask Signal to hand over their user data, their response is simple: we don't have any. That means Whittaker oversees the most private messaging platform on the planet. But it also means that there's almost certainly illegal activity happening on Signal that no one, including Signal, has any knowledge of. So the conversation you're about to hear isn't just about Tumbler Ridge. The idea that we should be willing to trade privacy for safety has permeated the entire technology sector. Amazon recently rolled out a feature that lets you scan an entire neighborhood's worth of Ring cameras. And countries like Australia and Denmark have introduced laws requiring teenagers to verify their ages before they can use social media. I want to be clear, all these technologies have real value, but we need to be equally clear-eyed about what they ask you to give up in return. And I wanted to ask Whittaker why she thinks that trade, your privacy for your safety, might not be worth it. Meredith Whittaker, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
I want to start with an incident that a lot of Canadians, frankly, are thinking about right now. A few weeks ago, there was a school shooting in a small town called Tumbler Ridge, BC. And it turned out, we learned last week, that the shooter had been talking to ChatGPT about the shooting, and that conversation was flagged somehow to people within the company, 12 of whom discussed it and urged the company to report that conversation to law enforcement. But then they ultimately decided not to. This happened 8 months ago, so 7 months before the incident occurred. I want to start here because the conversation in Canada has gone immediately to, well, they should have. And that there should be mandatory flagging of these kinds of conversations. Do you think that's where this conversation should be going?
Well, that is quite a nexus to unpack. I think, school shooting and the rampant occurrence of school shooting in the U.S. and now expanding to Canada and other places is horrifying. And I think there is a reflex to do something after these school shootings. And I think we often get fixated on sort of technical solutions, hoping that will cure really gnarly social problems. And I think mandatory flagging of conversations, I don't have information about how many other conversations are flagged. How long does it take law enforcement to act on those? What types of terms would be flagged in such conversations? How would those impact potentially marginalized people or people who are engaging in activities that under one administration may have been legal and under another are criminalized? who gets to decide what is done with those flags, and really importantly here, what other sources of information
do they have access to already?
Are available?
Right?
What
Right.
other levers are available to law enforcement? And I think in particular about, some of these debates around, that Signal gets implicated in, where if you zoom out, you recognize that, a lack of data isn't often the problem. It's a lack of resources to pursue these leads. It's a lack of social services that would, for example, here, hypothetically, have flagged this troubled person. What is a holistic approach to what is a horrifying social problem? Gun control comes to mind in the US. So I am very, very cautious around things like mandatory flagging. I think what this does tell us is that everything you send to a ChatGPT server is in the hands of, OpenAI, potentially Microsoft, and that is being reviewed by people, and that they could turn that over to the Canadian government, and then perhaps that would,
and they are to the U.S. government, probably,
the U.S.
right?
government, immigration control, another regime that pushes on them for that, and that does raise awareness around some of the potential consequences of these systems and the type of centralized control and insight that they give those who run and operate them.
What might some of the risks of this mandatory flagging be from your perspective?
I want to bring it to something concrete for Signal. And that's, in the EU, there is this legislative proposal that is in the name of protecting children, which we all fervently agree with, would mandate scanning private messages and undermining end-to-end encryption, which is the technology we have in a world where surveillance is ubiquitous to protect the fundamental human right to private communication. And the danger there is simply that the definition of what is and is not permissible shifts. We have seen abuse of surveillance powers throughout history, but we have never seen surveillance powers that are as pervasive as what the large tech companies, with their huge amounts of data, their ability to instrument our social, economic, professional lives, now have in hand. And we need to recognize that scanning private messages for criminal behavior could begin to extend into scanning private messages for dissent. We know that in the US, administrative subpoenas have been used to ask the tech companies, very recently, for information and identification of people who have exercised their First Amendment rights to criticize the government and criticize its immigration policies. We know that there's a woman who lived in jail, went to prison, was convicted because Meta turned over, we can say scanned if we want, but turned over her private messages with her daughter that showed her working to help her daughter access reproductive care and deal with the aftermath in the state of Nebraska after the Dobbs decision, which had enabled Nebraska to criminalize what was a formerly legal procedure. And so I do think we need to understand that a world in which we can't communicate freely is a world in which we can't dissent, is a world in which we can't live beautiful, intimate, open lives, in which we can't have new ideas, and that, there is the Venn diagram is a bit of a circle when it comes to that and authoritarianism.
I want to come back to the types of conversations that happen with Signal and some of the regulatory environment around that. But I'm wondering if
we don't know what types of conversations happen.
And that's kind of what but they are also,
we don't have access to the data.
But we do, no, and that's important, right? Because Signal is encrypted and OpenAI chats, for example, are not.
OpenAI chats, you are talking to a server controlled by OpenAI that has that data. They can do what they want with it.
And that feels like a material difference to me, in that, because there's a number of things there that are going on. One is with Signal, there's an assumption that it's a conversation between two people with an assumption of privacy. With a chatbot, we're talking to a product that's creating content that might be encouraging us to engage with it like a person, which might be creating an expectation of privacy. So we open up and speak to it in a way as if we would with a person, but it's not a person, it's a product. So how should we think about privacy in that context? Should we expect privacy, or should we even think about it as a private space in any way?
I don't think it's reasonable to expect privacy. They're not built for privacy. Indeed, OpenAI would not be able to roll out advertisements if these were truly private. And I think, it is concerning. You hit the nail on the head, in my view, that the simulation of an intimate conversation, a sentient and patient interlocutor, lulls us into treating this as an intimate conversation, into perhaps disclosing or saying things we maybe don't even believe, but we want to engage in a way where we feel heard, and testing out ideas. And that then on the other end of that is not a loving and sentient interlocutor who is interested in our every word and encouraging our every dream. It's a large company that's outlaid a huge amount of capex that needs to capitalize on that can do what they want with that data, that is participating in the core business model of the tech industry, which is collecting as much data as possible and monetizing that. But it's I think there's almost a psychological bait and switch, because if you look back at the Eliza effect, which is it's well documented, the tendency for people to, I'll use a psychoanalytic term, like cathect to these systems, to project onto them.
And Eliza was one of the first chatbots,
Yeah,
right?
it was
a very
the first
crude
chatbot.
version of a chatbot. Not even really AI, right? Just a very crude system.
It was a command line interface that simulated a therapeutic session. So it was a decision tree, nothing we would call AI now. It was, Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT created it, a long time ago. And he wrote about his experience, being troubled by the experience after creating it, on seeing a person he worked with ask him to shut the door because she was talking to Eliza and wanted privacy for that interaction. And, even in this rudimentary system, which now we would scoff at, we wouldn't have any kind of, the sort of feelings for it. There was this, humans will go 90% of the way to fill in the gaps. And I think, of course, these chatbots are virtuosic. It really does feel like you're talking to someone, and it's very difficult to rein in, the feelings and the sort of sense of ease and security that you have, because our experience with that is 99.99%.
That is a human
talking to another human,
right? And so we're bringing a norm from a previous world into a new technology, which is ill-suited for it, I think, or mismatched with, or allows us to be taken advantage of in a way too, like
exactly.
you say.
Yeah.
But I wonder if one of the things then we might need to sacrifice, if we accept that these are de facto not private, is some of the utility that people get from them. Because people are doing that in many ways, are using it because they find some usefulness or value in using a chatbot in that way. But maybe that's just not aligned with the way the technology is designed, and we just might have to sacrifice that use case as a society.
Sure. I mean, what the lever of sacrifice is, how we do that, I think social media was very good at capitalizing on the insight that people's favorite subject is themselves. And so this is this is kind of catnip, particularly in a world where, we have stats up and down. People are more alienated. They work longer hours. The commutes are worse. Finding friends is hard. And so we're, is that a willing sacrifice that we're putting onto individual consumers to say, now, grit your teeth and buckle up. Yes, we understand that, the best sort of gambling psychologists in the world have worked to make this extremely irresistible, but you are a bad person if you don't resist it. Or, how are we thinking about that mechanism actually working, particularly when we think about, more vulnerable, I don't know, children. I think about my parents, and they're being, kind of old and, very, very smart, but a bit guileless when it comes to these things.
Well, now we're doing the same in a much more intimate way, where we're offloading that intimacy and that personal relationship rather than just the broad information flow that we were in relation.
When you think about how that can be weaponized, particularly in the context of selling advertisements, which is, it's a tiny hair between selling a product and then selling an ideology. selling a political perspective, selling a vision of the world that may or may not map to reality, but is convenient for one or another actor.
Do you think there's a version of this technology that does protect privacy that's possible, or is it just an inherently privacy violating technology?
I would say yes and yes in some sense, right? I think it is absolutely possible to build AI systems that are much more privacy preserving than what we are seeing today. Marlon Spike, who is the founder of Signal, has just launched something called Confer, which is it's a chatbot system, but it's the server provides privacy and uses encryption. So yes, you are talking to, a server on the back end, but it is not going to AI. It is encrypted. It's not being disclosed. So there, that's a way that you're certainly raising the privacy bar.
Do you think that's a good thing to exist?
I think it's more private, than the alternative. But we also have to recognize that AI, this current deep learning paradigm of AI, which sort of became, it's still what we're working with LLMs and these large models, and sort of kicked into gear in the early 2010s, is built on a business model of surveillance. And this is not hyperbole. This is really just looking at the history of the tech industry and how it formed. You had large platforms that emerged out of the commercialization of the internet in the 1990s. They scaled, they built platforms, whether those social media platforms or marketplaces. They invested in large scale computational infrastructure to gather and index data to serve people on those platforms. Those platforms gathered more data. There's a feedback loop there. Economies of scale were established. And then in the early 2010s, it was, they recognized that old deep learning approaches from the late 1980s, early 1990s were actually really useful when they were paired with huge amounts of data. And that really explains why the winners of the first wave of tech are also the winners of AI, because it requires these resources. Yes, you have OpenAI, but OpenAI is bolted onto Microsoft because Microsoft has Azure. You have Anthropic, but Anthropic has deals with Google, with Amazon, because that infrastructure is so important. So yes, it relies on surveillance, this data. It has also produced a hunger for more data. If you see the sort of privacy laws being pushed back, if you see, Amazon, a few months ago announced that, the Amazon Alexa is just going to send all your queries for AI training. We're not even giving a pretext to privacy, whereas in the past that would have been a much more controversial decision. So, all of that is just a material cross-section. Like, this is the technical reality of what this large-scale deep learning-based AI does and how we need to think about it. It is not saying that it is only a surveillance technology or that, it is somehow not useful for other things, but our analysis needs to include this fundamental material understanding.
The core genesis of this current technology, as you said, is this vast amount of data and also this incredible compute needed to process and make sense of it. Both of those, and certainly the latter, requires an enormous capital investment. I wonder if that just creates a financial incentive that makes these inherently path dependent towards a surveillance economy. I mean, I'm not sure how you get out of that, right? Like, how do you commoditize to the degree they need to without breaking privacy?
Yeah. Well, I think, OpenAI announcing it will introduce ads is exactly that. Right?
It's that pressure. It's that
where's
that
the
annual
money?
Revenue requirement that increases every round.
And ads are not sexy. No one wants to see an ad. They were roundly dragged, and Anthropic had some pretty elegant Super Bowl ads, in response.
And Sam Altman said himself he never wanted to do it because that would be gross, right?
Well, Sam's good at the 1-2 no.
I mean, I wonder, is there a public option to this here? Like, is this just the problem of leaving all of this to 4 or 5 large American companies? Like, is that the root cause of this problem? And we should be thinking much more creatively about financing AI?
Well, I think we should be thinking much more creatively about financing, but I think what I don't want to do is get stuck into a technologically deterministic trap. Like, we want, exactly these systems, like a chatbot based AI economy, which, chatbots to me are, they're virtuosic, but they're kind of boring, right? And everyone is just obsessed with chatbots, and there's so much more you can do with AI. There's so much more you can do with tech that gets kind of left in the dark because everyone is just indexing on this one form. And, one, the question is, what do we want this technology to do to create the world we want? That's a political question. That is not a technical question. And the question of what world we want is the, core question of politics and democracy and other forms of governance, right?
And of us,
citizenship,
right? It's something we need to decide collectively, right? Yeah.
So I think, in some sense, it's like, let's take back the agency to make that determination, right? What do we want our schools to look like? Do we want, like our healthy lunches for all children better for the health of our youth and society than, say, a license with a meta educational chatbot, right? Like, how are we weighing these things? But the goal there is healthy youth and society, right? A pedagogy that enriches, that, allows people to live, full, joyful lives, contributing and, being included, all of that, right? What meets that goal? And then what technological investments would help get there? What technology aids us on that path? How do we govern it? Because I don't think we have spent much time thinking about how we govern this type of technology. Okay, we've built tech that is meant to ensure, this healthy youth and society goal for our education system. How are we determining that the code is actually doing that? All of those to me are almost more interesting questions than like who should pay for it. It's like and what is the it doing, and how do we make sure what it's doing is beneficial and legit?
Yeah, and what these are doing is evolving really quickly. We've gone from pretty basic chatbots to agents that are out doing things in the world and online. Does anything concern you about that new capability?
Yeah. I mean, I think the coding agents in particular are doing some pretty impressive.
Yeah.
It's like remarkable. A competent junior programmer that sometimes does weird stuff, but hey, who doesn't? So I almost caveat that because that's not the problem. The issue is that this sort of, again, agency is a bit of a funny word, or AI agent is a bit of a funny word because it's not a technical term of art. It kind of indicates capacities, and ultimately, like, the two key features of what we're calling AI agents is that they, have access to context, we call it, but context is your data, as much information about your environment or your, whatever it is,
the various
as possible.
Apps you use, the folders on your computer, your logins on your accounts files, online, your files, your
performance reviews, whatever it is. So pervasive access to data as much as possible. And then it has to have the capacity to act independently, right? An agent that checks in every 3 seconds, like a cookie banner, saying like, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? Helpful. Is not actually an agent.
Yeah.
So you can build agents that have less access to data. You can build agents that check in every step, but at some point they kind of lose the characteristic of agents, or they are simply not that useful. And we've done a bit of an example, right? You have an agent that is running on your device, and it's an agent that's supposed to, help you with administrative tasks. And I'm giving kind of a hypothetical marketing pitch, but this is the type of thing you hear from these companies. And, you say, okay, agent, I would like you to plan a birthday party for me and invite my 4 closest friends. And that's cool, right? The agent can go off and do that. And maybe you get to, go to Pilates class or, I don't know, meditate, whatever you do. But in order to do that, of course, the agent would need access to your browser. So driving your browser as if it were you, kind of faking it's your persona. It would need access to your credit card to book the restaurant. It would need access to your calendar. It would need access to your contact list. And in this case, if you're a dedicated Signal user, as I hope everyone listening is, it would need access to your Signal messages, to text with your friends on your behalf, to see when they're available, to let them know about the reservation, and to schedule the time. And it's that access to signal messages that in our case is deeply concerning.
So it now can do that. You can now give an agent access to Signal. Is there any limitation on that?
There's no agent that has been shipped on the operating system that automatically has access to Signal messages. But what I'm painting is sort of...
But you can give it? You can authorize it, though? Like, could I give an agent access to my Signal account?
People have done that with Claudebot.
Okay.
Yeah. So said, like, send messages on my behalf. We had, a handful of agents that were very easily hackable, where some people's Signal messages were left in the open,
that feels like a real vulnerability to the encryption
because of the vulnerabilities
the safeguard
in
encryption,
that
right?
system.
Like that's essentially just
that undermines our ability
fundamentally
to protect privacy at the application level.
Absolutely.
Because the barrier for hackers and hostile nation states is no longer Signal's gold standard encryption that for over a decade has been reviewed by the best hackers and security researchers in the world and found to be best in class and invulnerable. The vulnerability is some agentic system that is, in the case of Claudebot, very interesting, but built in an incredibly insecure way. Or, a context window, a folder on your desktop that has
de facto
imported all of the data.
Secure. I mean, what you're describing is an environment in which there is virtually, I heard an interview with the guy who developed Claudebot, and he was saying, look, like now that it's being used by X million people, I am now going to start focusing on the security of it. And that is a remarkable invulnerability if any number of those Claudebots are using Signal.
Yes. Yeah, or are given access to Signal. And one of the things that's really disturbing me in this is that the rhetoric is, move fast, adopt this, or get left behind. But the conversation around security and just basic hygiene is not accompanying that. So there's an anxiety to, adopt. There's a lot of people who don't have the fundamental education around security 101. How do you think about systems? What does it mean for an agent to be scraping your screen buffer, to gather data on your Signal messages out of your operating system? They're kind of joining at the vibe coding level of abstraction, not at a sort of rigorous understanding of how the full stack works and what the fallibilities are and what the material reality is. And then are being encouraged to adopt things without clarity on some of the dangers. And it's not, in the case of Signal, it's not just a danger to you, it's a danger to anyone who speaks to you. So you're talking about kind of poisoning a network. So, what I want to be clear on is this is not pervasive yet. We have seen a handful of examples where people did give access. This is not something that is being shipped on Android or iOS or Windows yet. But when I recite that promise of planning a birthday party, that's basically marketing copy from any AI agentic company.
That and restaurant reservations, which it seems we all spend so much time on. It's
right? And the birthday parties happen in a restaurant, so you gotta. And so the concern is that in order to keep those promises, we're going to see increasingly pervasive permissions given to agents, again, under the kind of magic wand rhetoric of, these are magical systems, these are, your personal genie, without people, I think, really absorbing what it means to have a system, creating a vector into your most intimate information, undermining the ability of application developers like Signal to protect privacy at the application level, and then sending that data off-site to be processed by a number of LLMs. And again, we come back to the front of this interview, and we recognize 12 people reviewing text in a very somber context. But how many people are reviewing your Signal messages? How many people have access to your banking data? How many people have access to your corporate IP because you got around IT security and installed one of these things on your desktop? So that's it's hard to overstate the level of concern if we continue turning the ratchet down this path.
I mean, when you frame it like that, which is compelling, it makes many of the privacy fights you've been involved with over the past 10 years seem quaint, frankly. Like, this feels like a 5-alarm fire to the things you have
Yeah,
worked
I would
on.
say if we'd won, we wouldn't be here. Yeah, points for trying and not points for succeeding. Yeah, it does seem like a 5-alarm fire, and there are many things we can do to mitigate this, right? This is not lost, but it's what's been concerning to me is this sort of wholesale aphasia of basic cybersecurity, privacy hygiene 101, which I do think is compelled in part by just the astounding capex outlay, the economic anxiety around, what's AI going to be doing to jobs? I need to catch up. I need to train. Like, you can't, go on a subway without an ad in New York City that's like, get AI ready, right? It's clearly there's a kind of cultural moment of fear, and then a rhetoric from the tech industry that I think is irresponsibly narrating, these technologies as almost akin to a godhead, as this is intelligence. Are these even human, right? That's a less interesting question to me than, how are they going to undermine our core cybersecurity and the institutions that rely on it?
I just want to reset for our final few minutes here on something else you've been very involved in, which is the increasing momentum we've seen globally for government policies to protect children online. Having worked in the space for a while now too, I've never seen a policy proposal break through in the way that I have seen social media bans break through, for example. 90% of Canadians support a social media ban. And that creates pretty strong incentives for a government to want to do it. And a core to that policy is the capability to verify age. And I know you've been really involved in this conversation in multiple jurisdictions. So I just want to flesh that out a little bit, since we're in the middle of this conversation, literally as we speak, in Canada right now. So what's your broad reaction to these kinds of policies that seek to restrict or treat access for children to technologies differently than adults?
Well, I will say at the outset that I do think they are trying to address a real issue. And what we see at the level of implementation, though, is not pretty. Age verification systems don't work that well. And, concerningly, particularly at this moment in history, they ultimately are creating an identity layer that tracks people across their use of, the internet, which is kind of a quaint term at this point. But what do you look at? Who are you? Are you allowed to access this? Okay, you access that. We're now logging your access to that. And I think, because of course you can't tell that somebody is young and thus needs to be banned unless you can also tell that somebody is older and does not need to be banned.
So it's age verification for everybody, not just for children. It has to be. I mean, right? De facto has
how do you distinguish? My critique of these is one, they don't really work. VPNs and other technologies allow you to get around these. It's not, effective in stopping children from accessing different types of information, but it does create, basically it's bolting another surveillance apparatus onto the side of these problematic technologies, these platform business models, ad-supported social media, instead of what I would say is addressing the core problem, is that our information environment has been ceded to a handful of platforms that are, calibrated and optimized for engagements and have, effectively centralized control over how our, what information we see and thus kind of how our reality is defined. That's the core issue. So yeah, I'm critical, and I'm actually concerned that, again, under the classic guise of protecting children, what we're seeing is increased surveillance of access to particular types of content at a time where, as we reviewed, that is being weaponized in ways that we should be pretty alarmed about.
How do you deal with that popular, I'm actually not, I think social media bans particularly are a bit of an ineffective Band-Aid on a much bigger structural problem, as you lay out. But how do you deal with the reality that they now have just this massive public support?
Look, I don't want to say they're not desired, right? I do think, there's a problem that people identify, and it's that, our kids seem enthralled, our kids seem disconnected, our kids, like we're seeing, maybe ourselves, we, like numb out on the couch watching stupid reels and then feel kind of shitty. No one feels good after being on social media, like no one, right? And so, okay, how do we deal with that fact that this thing seems both beguiling and catnipy, and also we don't like it. We don't like the way it makes us feel. We don't like the way it intermediates our connections with other human beings. And, we don't seem to have the individual will escape velocity. Certainly our children don't, to sort of get out of that. Right. And, to me, like, okay, so let's ban it. Let's make sure the kids don't have access to it. That's a quick and easy, intuitive solution. I think there is a bigger pathology in the business model itself. It is very dangerous for a scant handful of companies to have such pervasive control over our information environment and have so much data that they're able to kind of gamify to sort of, ensure that we are, continuing to be attracted to these platforms. And I think that bigger issue is the one, it implicates democracy. It implicates sort of, ground truth. It implicates, how we interact with each other and our world as citizens. And any lever that I think is actually going to make a real difference would have to address the core business model itself.
I agree with you on the business model being a key aspect of this, but is it in your view a sufficient fix for the range of problems and challenges we're talking about? And that, like, surely there are some features of a technology, of a social platform, regardless of the business model, that could be offered to kids that we think are more suitable for adults than kids as a society, and we would like not provided to kids. And that would then require some form of verification, wouldn't it? Or some way of knowing who's a kid and who's an adult. Like, how do we get around that ultimate challenge here, is that, like, kids aren't adults, and maybe they shouldn't have all the same things adults do.
I think I need to take that on a case-by-case basis. And two, I would say, like, there's no one better at figuring out parental controls than kids. Like, I just, having grown up as the person who could, like, fix the VCR, right, when my dad couldn't.
Yeah.
And, kids aren't, like, stupid little creatures, right? Kids will, like, they may not be adults, but they also are living in our world. And when they are motivated and bored, they will find a way around a lot of these things, which is what we see. Okay, so you make them more draconian. Okay, well, then that's a more pervasive surveillance apparatus. Okay, well, then you ban VPNs. Okay, well, now you're shutting down a kind of, promise of a freer internet. Okay, well, now the things that are banned include LGBTQ healthcare, because that's now illegal. Okay, kids can't get access to that. Okay, kids in abusive families now have, significant parental controls, so they can't actually reach out to people. So I think this really assumes a sort of like version of childhood that isn't actually real for a lot of people, and it assumes a sort of benevolent, paternalistic set of adults that are responsible for gatekeeping, like, the wrong things from children while ensuring that they get only developmentally appropriate things. And that's not the world we live in. Abuse happens in the family. You have a lot of children needing access to resources that are often curtailed. You have sexual education, which is vital for children understanding how to protect themselves from, certain types of abuse, or just, how to live in the world as people who understand consent and, other vital, skills for living, that is being sort of, taken away from youth and children. And so again, we can't just paint this with a broad brush. And I think, as I've done now, you have to get into more uncomfortable territory, the gnarly social and dynamics of these issues, to really get your arms around them.
Just to close, I mean, we do seem in a world now where a ton of people have Ring cameras, people have Alexas in their houses. They're now talking and sharing very intimate details with chatbots. Parents seem willing to sacrifice some degree of privacy to protect their kids, right? It just feels we're in this like really different moment for this conversation than we were a decade ago, for example. But I'm wondering, I've heard you say, we've made privacy into this technocratic concept that makes it feel like we don't have a stake in it. Like, how do you convince people when they are opting in various ways to a whole host of things that you are arguing are fundamentally invasive to their privacy? How do you make them have a stake in that choice?
Yeah, I mean, I like this question, but I'm also going to torque it a little because I think they do have a stake in this, and I don't think it's always a choice. I think people inherently, they know that bitchy DM they sent to their best friend that they didn't even mean, they were just in such a bad mood, is not something they want to show to the person it was about, right? They know that their Grindr messages are not something they would ever want their boss. Like, feel the stomach drop on that one, right? They know that their medical records, from that, thing they had that was weird and maybe a little embarrassing, are not something they want their new friend group to know. Like, we all have these boundaries, these sort of cell walls of our life, and that's what it means to have a full and complete life. But we are also social beings, right? And, Signal is it's a gold standard for private communications services. But it also is mapped to human relationships. It's not about Meredith in a vacuum sharing no information and, like a hermetically sealed and a anechoic chamber, right? No, it's about me sharing with the people I want to share with, right? Because ultimately we are social beings. We want to be loved. We want to be included. We want to be at the party, and we will do whatever it takes to get there. It's not really a choice, go Unabomber, live in the woods. But no, that is not cute. That is not something that is actually workable for participation in our world. And so I think when we frame this as an individual choice, it's almost like the way that the fossil fuel industry invented the concept of the carbon footprint, which sounds virtuous, where every individual can calculate how much carbon they're spending and they feel kind of guilty when they throw away a plastic bag. When actually the culprit is there's a systemic issue around fossil fuel extraction and use that puts much more onus on these large institutions to do something about it than it does on us. Similar in privacy, when we have to log into a certain account that gives a bunch of data to apply for a job, when we kind of have to use social media because, application scanning and services that would, filter resumes when we are looking for a job would count not having a social media profile as, shady somehow, et cetera, et cetera. These are not things that are really choices. These are conditions of participating in life. And so, yeah, I do think we care about privacy. I don't think we've really been given a choice. And then add to that the fact that privacy as a conversation has been like bleached and deracinated to the point where like we're talking about data flows, not the fundamental value of having a rich life where you can express dissent and toy with ideas and have intimacy. You're in a world where you're kind of not talking about the thing that matters.
Is that what you meant by saying we should have a love-centric view of privacy? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. That's we're getting into some of my maybe more philosophical work, but I was a couple of years ago, I was really animated by this. Why the heck would we care about private? Like, what does privacy protect, right? Privacy is a great value. I talk about privacy all the time, but like, I'm also so bored with that debate, getting into rooms with people who are like, data protection, data sovereignty. And I'm like, data isn't really what I care about, right? What I care about is the ability to have a full life. I care about, human thriving, and, privacy is something that protects our ability to sort of think and relate to each other transformatively. And then, kind of getting into the weeds of like, how do you transform a self, a relationship, a world, when the ability to tell your story, your place in the world, has already been sclerotically inscribed in a database via the collection of your data, the authority to tell your story being in the hands of the companies that, have collected and created this data about you. And so, the argument there is that privacy needs to be preserved before data is created, because it's actually the act of defining you that violates your privacy. And then, that definition exists in a database somewhere and is determining very materially whether you get health insurance, whether you get a loan, whether you get a job, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very, very high level view of that argument.
Maybe that's a subject for an additional conversation sometime.
Yeah.
But look, I mean,
I'd be into it.
We
I
ended,
hope the audience
well, I would too. And we ended philosophically, but look, these debates are also like front and center of the public mind right now in the way they're living their lives. And it's not a philosophic debate about privacy. It's debate about safety and security and our children and our schools. And I mean, these are very visceral things people are living through. So thank you for talking about them with me.
Thank you so much. It was really wonderful to be here.